So we will directly move on to our next session. And we just heard it. The rule of law is at risk, or more generally, the trade environment is in a flux. And what we will do now is we will discuss how trade considerations are reshaping competition enforcement. We heard already from Teresa Ribera a few themes that are in her mind, such as resilience, supply chains, the FSR, and that's precisely topics that we will cover now. And before we move on to our discussion, let me first introduce our fantastic panel. And I will start on the other side with Denis Redonnet. And Denis is the Deputy Director General at the Commission's DG Trade and is at the same time the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. Being economist by training, Denis headed DG Trade's WTO and strategy divisions, and before he served as a director for WTO legal affairs and trade in goods. So you see, that's experience that underpins his current role deploying the Commission's modern trade enforcement toolkit, and gives us very valuable insights here. Let me move on then to Paola Conconi. Paola is professor of economics at the Oxford University and a professional fellow at the New College. Paola directs also CPR's research network on global value chains, trade and development, has held an ERC advanced grant on trade and agreements and supply chains, and has published in leading academic journals such as the AER, which is very well known probably in the economic community. And now, having introduced people that are specialists in trade, let us move on to some faces which might be very familiar and don't need an introduction in the competition community, but let me nevertheless spend a few words on Benoît Coeuré, who is the president of France's Autorité de la concurrence, and very important today also, that he served previously as at the European Central Bank's executive board, where he oversaw market operations, payments and market infrastructures, and international relations, and then headed also the Bank for International Settlement Innovation Hub, while chairing also the BIS Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures. And you will see that this is something that will also play an important role in our discussion. Lately, this year, he also became chair of the OECD's Competition Committee and brings, of course, a rare combination of monetary, financial infrastructure and competition building, competition policy experience. Next, we have Emanuele Tarantino. Emanuele is the chief economist here at DG Comp. He is at the same time professor at Luis University in Rome, and before we know him very well actually because he has been for many years in the economic advisory group on competition policy, and of course has also published widely in our field of competition. And last but not least, we have Marcus Bokkerink, and Marcus chaired the UK Competition and Market Authority until this year, after having a really steep career at Boston Consulting Group, where he rose to senior partner and managing director, and he now serves as the non-executive director on the board of Pinsent Masons and sits on several governance bodies, which I will not mention explicitly. So we see that Marcus brings the business perspective here to this round. So, and my name is Benno Bühler. I'm vice president at the Brussels and Munich offices, and I'm having the pleasure today to moderate this discussion. That said, let us jump in directly. We will first try to cover the big picture, introduce to you, how objectives in trade and competition align. We'll then move on to what this means for our toolbox in competition. We'll then have a look at the enforcement realities and how and the interplay between trade and competition, and will then, if time permitting, have a few thoughts about what this means for the future. To kick off, Benoît, you're in a special position because you not only have your competition experience, but you also have all the valuable experiences before at the ECB. Can you explain to us how you think that the key objectives of competition and trade align?
Thank you, Benno, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Look, I think the short version of what I'm going to say is just, what a time to be alive. And what I'm saying here is that we need to, the situation is so unusual that we'll have to move out of our comfort zones and also try to rethink what we're doing, including on the competition side for the future. Another way to start the discussion would be to quote Antonio Gramsci and his famous sentence on, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters. So that's Antonio Gramsci. I think that sets the stage for our discussion. So, and the situation we're in, and I'm sure Denis and Paola will expand on it, is that global trade is under attack. And I like the way another economist colleague, Richard Baldwin, puts it, and he says, what the US have started on April the 2nd, 2025, this is not a trade war, this is a war on trade. That is the whole concept on which the global economy had been established and was functioning. That concept is now being challenged, and there is a high risk that competition enforcement also is held as an hostage to that broader discussion. So what can competition do in this very challenging environment? I would say two things, and I'm going to go a little bit into the details. First, and that might look, and what I'm going to say might sound as a contradiction, and I will do my best to explain how it's not a contradiction. First, and that echoes what Teresa Ribera has said a few minutes ago, we should protect enforcement under the rule of law and not let competition enforcement be corrupted or contaminated by the discussion on trade. But second, and as importantly, we also need to do our homework so that our economy, the European economy, is as strong as possible to stand firmly in that very challenging environment. And so what does it imply? First, protecting competition enforcement, and here I don't need to be very long because Executive Vice President Ribera has been very clear about it. That means, as using Teresa's words earlier last month, not to give in to threat or blackmail. I'm using the EVP's words here. And standing by the rule of law. And I would even say that the reason we're doing it is for the business. We want companies, irrespective of their passport and nationality, to operate in Europe under a sound legal framework. And that's also a sign of times. But being able to tell companies that we will respect the rule of law, that mergers will not be decided in the president's office, neither in Brussels nor in Paris, I think that's a competitive advantage for Europe now. And I wouldn't have imagined I would say that one day, but now I can say that. That is a competitive advantage of Europe, to enforce the rule of law and to offer legal predictability and security to companies. And the ability to, of course, to appeal in an appeal court or a Supreme Court, irrespective of their nationalities. So that's the first thing. Now, of course, the other thing is that there are important challenges to be addressed on the trade side, and I'm not going to expand on it because I'm not a specialist of trade, but that also means that we've got to assign the right instruments to the right policies. That is, when it comes to trade distortions, we have traditional trade protection tools. I'm sure Denis will speak to it. We have the sovereign subsidy regulation, very importantly. And the more we can make it work in an effective way, with limited resources, I know that, but the better. So the Commission has been building credibility and has to continue to keep building credibility around the FSR so that it can become a key instrument in our toolbox. And we have FDI rules, which are also being strengthened, revisited, and strengthened as we speak. And if things get worse, Europe should not hesitate to use its anti-coercion instrument, which hasn't been used so far, be it against China or against the US, if needs be. So, and the last thing is we should preserve international cooperation on the ground. And Benoît, you mentioned the OECD. I think the OECD is a great place where we keep engaging with a very broad range of countries, including, very importantly, first and foremost, with the US. And I'm very glad that my colleague, Gail Slater, who's the Assistant AG for Antitrust, is chairing Working Party number 3 in the OECD, and she's actively engaging. Recently, the OECD Council endorsed a revision of the OECD merger recommendation. That was approved by the US. We're going to start work on 2 possible new recommendations at the OECD, and it's a multi-year project, so don't expect too much in the short term, but we're going to start discussing it. One recommendation on market studies, that is advocacy and market studies, which is an important tool that we have as competition agencies, and one possible recommendation on unilateral conduct, which the OECD so far doesn't have. That has been approved by the US. So I'm spending a lot of time, I can tell you, with the help of my European colleagues and other colleagues, to engage with the US in that framework and make sure that we can keep our cooperation alive on the ground, and it is working. Finally, and that the other side of the same coin is that, of course, we want to protect competition enforcement. We wanted to operate within the rule of law. We don't want it to be corrupted by politics. And by the way, if you think it's smart to use a competition policy to advance trade objectives or broader geopolitical objectives, you're not going to like the outcome at home, because local politicians and vested interests will jump on it and start politicizing competition enforcement also at home, which will undermine our ability to protect our citizens in terms of their purchasing power, affordability, and so on. So if you start politicizing competition from one side, you're not going to stop it, and it's going to be politicized also at home, and we don't want to see that. Finally, how do we do our homework? We do our homework by making sure that our toolbox as competition enforcers is fully used. And again, Teresa has expanded on it, and I don't need to come back to what she said. That's about, of course, the new merger guidelines, which will be discussed throughout the day here, I guess. That's also about, it's not only about mergers. We can also, in the antitrust sphere, we can make sure that agreements which are between companies which are conducive to resilience or to autonomy or to carbon efficiency can be cleared under a certain set of conditions. We've done it for sustainability agreements. As you know, the Commission has done it under 1013. We need to expand that reflection and also to address resilience and autonomy and to see what can be achieved under 101. And that hasn't been done yet. We need to do it nationally and at a European level. And we need to advocate for pro-competitive industrial policies so that all the money that is being invested by European government, and it's a lot of money, is not wasted. And for that, we want it to be invested in a way that is pro-competitive. And that will be my conclusion. That's, in my view, that's first and foremost about the infrastructures which Europe needs to compete and to thrive in the global economy. That's about AI infrastructures, data centers, compute, and the like. That is about cloud infrastructures. We don't have sovereignty in cloud services in Europe. So that's a key weakness from a strategic standpoint. And if competition can help addressing it, so be it. That's also about financial infrastructures, which you mentioned, Beno. So for instance, decentralized finance, DeFi, has a big potential to expand in Europe. We have fantastic startups in DeFi, but we don't have the right infrastructures. And if we do it in a pro-competitive way, then we'll hit two birds with the same stone. We can improve our economic strength, our resilience, and our autonomy, and at the same time, we can lay the foundations for vibrant European ecosystems. We've done it in payments, for instance. We can do it in many other areas, and I stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Benoît. So you gave us already quite a few themes that we will cover then in our discussion. But before we go there, let me quickly turn to Paola. And Benoît, you mentioned China, you mentioned US, you mentioned also a few objectives that, at least in our competition arena, were not always front of mind. Paola, can you give us the broader context? Can you help us understand basically how these new considerations come in?
I'll try. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. So there's a lot of focus now on recent developments, in particular the tariffs introduced since Liberation Day. Even before, in February already, Trump started with a new round of tariffs. But I think to understand these recent developments, we really need to zoom back a few decades and look at the evolution of world trade over the last decades. And so I would even start in 1947. That's when the GATT was created, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, that was signed post-World War II by 23 members, the US, the UK, France was Canada, 23 members, nations that wanted to avoid the 1930s, this era of protectionism, of unilateral protectionism that led to retaliation and trade wars. And so this new rules-based system was created with the idea of having, again, rules for multilateral cooperation to avoid getting back to these trade wars. And the system, started post-World War II, 47, and then over the decades expanded, in terms of membership, in terms of focus from only trading goods to trading services, and over 8 rounds of successful multilateral liberalization, tariffs went down. The last round was the Uruguay round that led to the creation of the World Trade Organization in 95. So this was, a successful multilateral trading system that created certainty for trade and investment. And I would say the break in the system came in 2001. We didn't understand it, I think, at the time. But that's when China entered the WTO, became a member. And we were all, I think, a bit naive in thinking that China would become a market economy. So in the protocol of accession of China to the WTO, which was negotiated over 15 years, there was this, again, presumption that China would become a market economy, would not massively subsidize, SOE would be deregulated. And I think this was very naive. And what we saw was really what we now know in the academic literature is called the China shock, which is basically, a massive surge in Chinese exports, which has led, has had consequences, both economic and political consequences in other members of the system. So we know there's been a lot of import competition and decline in particular industries that suffer massive competition from China. And so what the US, the EU, and other members try to do is to use the old toolkit that we had in the GATT WTO, which was anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards to some extent. So these are the so-called trade defense instrument or temporary trade barriers, TTBs, that governments could use to defend themselves from rise import competition. But this toolkit was written pre-China, was written when the GATT WTO was a set of countries that were alike, were mostly Western democracies. And although you may worry about subsidies, Boeing, Airbus, and subsidies to aircraft, these were targeted subsidies. And you could use those tools. We're going to talk later about countervailing duties. These were designed, the use of those tools was designed for market economies. And I think, China challenged the system in a way that is unprecedented. So governments try to use those tools, but I think there are lots of limits to what you can do with countervailing, anti-dumping, safeguards if there is massive intervention in all sectors. It's not targeted, as it is the case of China. And so I think there was growing frustration with the system and the fact that the rules prevented a more systematic protection. And that led to Trump 1, which was, a start of use of special tariffs, WTO incompatible in 2018 against China only, and leading to the US-China trade war in 2018. And then I agree with Richard's view that the recent round of tariffs has gone. So here is really, we have abandoned the multilateral trading system. We are really at the risk of going back to the 1930s, because now Trump is no longer targeting China. He's just abandoned the multilateral trading system altogether. And that's a real concern. So let me stop there, and we can pick up some of these issues, I'm sure, later.
Thanks, Paola. Marcus, you want to have a quick comment on that?
I mean, just thank you for inviting me as well, and it's good to see everybody. And just taking the perspective, if you put yourself in the shoes of consumers and of businesses, and on this question, from that perspective, the objectives of competition policy, the objectives of trade policy, are really driven by the same underlying objectives. One of the two fundamental objectives that citizens, people, whether as consumers or as people working in businesses or investors, that they want from their governments is to deliver economic growth and prosperity. It's simply put, and it's so three quick observations. It's precisely for that reason. It's in order to deliver economic growth and prosperity that after centuries and decades of trial and error, nations have landed on this idea that promoting competition, promoting the ability for there to be alternatives for customers who can choose between alternatives freely is kind of important, because in order to drive growth, they need to drive innovation, they need to drive productivity, and they've learnt through all these experiments that the best way to do that is to have customers being able to move between alternatives, the pressure and the incentive that creates, and the ability for any business person, any entrepreneur, to bring an innovation to market without being held back or blocked. And it's precisely for the same underlying reason that after years of experimentation, nations have landed on the policies of free trade and indirect investment amongst trusted partners. Because again, they've learned that that's the best way to get more productive solutions to displace least productive solutions, and the best way for innovations to have the maximum impact. And what's interesting, I think, now is that the third thing that nations are rediscovering, perhaps, is that precisely by assuring that there is sufficient competitive alternative supply and assuring that there is sufficiently free, frictionless trade amongst trusted partners, that you have the best chance of avoiding over-dependence on one or two monopolies or duopolies for critical national infrastructure. In the past, that used to be telecoms, and now it's digital. And so by doing that, you're actually, as a nation, fulfilling the second core expectation of your electorate, which is democratic security. And so I think that the two policies and objectives are completely aligned if you get back to the fundamentals of them. And that's a positive story that governments could bear in mind versus some of the negative press that these two policies are getting.
That's interesting thoughts. Like the upshot of what I've heard so far is that we are living in an increasingly unstable world. There's basically our own experience in the competition arena has been that we are protected. We are basically enforcing in an environment where there is few disruptions from trade, and now we're moving to a new world, a new reality, where there are some players that are not playing anymore by the rules, maybe. So we are living in a more uncertain world, Denis, and now we need to think about what this means now for evolving competition toolbox. Now, you are, of course, a trade expert, but what would you think, how does this evolving or changing or pending trade environment, what does it mean for our trade policies and for our competition policies?
Thank you very much. I'm a bit the odd man out here because I don't usually attend competition conferences, and I'm not very qualified to talk about the competition policy toolbox, perhaps a bit more on the trade policy toolbox, although there probably are quite a lot of similarities or factors that have to be looked at in the same way between the way we are looking at trade defense, trade protection. What Paola was saying is very interesting in terms of do we have the tools that correspond to the reality in which we live, and perhaps competition policy. But I think it's more, so first of all, I would start by saying that I would come back to what Benoît said. I think it's more than an uncertain environment. I mean, it's an environment, an international trade regime, international trade relations are shaken at their core right now, both because you have a complete shift in policy from the United States, and indeed because I think China's state capitalist economic system has never been properly integrated into the international trading system, or at least insufficiently integrated into the international trading system. I think for us, so for trade policy, there's really one thing that has been, I think, impacting us, certainly as in the European Commission for the EU, over the last few years now. It's a single thing. It's how to manage the change in paradigm, where we move from a paradigm which was pretty much entirely focused on maximizing efficiency. So it was about all the trade policy frameworks, agreements, the WTO, in a large part, not only, but in a large part, was about maximizing economic efficiency. And now we have to introduce in a range of microeconomic policies, trade, probably competition as well, another dimension which sits alongside, which is a dose of consideration to be given to economic security or resilience. It doesn't mean we're moving from one paradigm entirely to the other, of course, and we certainly don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater of what economic integration in the global economy gives us by way of strength, by way of source of competitiveness. But there is a rebalancing of the framework. It is linked to the environment around us. It is linked to the hard collision of more geopolitics into international economic relations than before. There was always a link, but now it's probably more acute and more confrontational. And indeed, what Teresa Ribeiro was referring to, the erosion of elements of the rule of law, certainly at the international level, or certainly international economic law, let's say, i.e. the law of the WTO. So that means that yes, there are moments, places, situations where there needs to be some de-risking, and that de-risking can take the form of pockets of de-integration compared to the state of global economic integration has already been reached. Doesn't mean, by the way, that all this is one-dimensional or one-directional. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential for much more global economic integration, for example, through digital trade. But in some areas, there is some degree of a de-integration that is taking place. And the whole question is how that is done. Because if there is de-integration, it comes at a certain cost. There is a cost. So there is a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. And we just have to face up to this. I think it's impacting trade policies in different ways. In some ways, very negatively. In some ways, there are normal evolutions. So on the negative side, what we see, and the big concern for Europe, is the weaponization of trade and investment dependencies. Some of them, by the way, these dependencies resulting from other factors, for example, non-market policies and practices. I mean, the reason why we have a very high dependency on China when it comes to the upstream of critical industrial supply chains, on rare earth elements, CRMs, which are being restricted now through trade measures out of China, is because there is a market failure there that has enabled those dependencies to take place. The second, which is I think more inevitable, but which I find much less worrying, is the fact that there is, in that geopolitical context, more space for strategic trade control, strategic investment control. So the role that trade policies, and restrictive trade policies in this case, can play when it comes to legitimate security interest, and in the trade, tech, national security data nexus, I think there is going to be some pockets of de-integration, but which, if again done in a rules-based manner, in a controlled manner, do not necessarily need to be a source of great concern. And then there's, generally speaking, the question of how we articulate trade policy, not just vis-à-vis competition policy, but vis-à-vis industrial policies. And that's the big thing, because of course this is what is very insufficiently governed by international trade rules. That whole zone is the weak part of the framework, and this is where at the moment, notably because everybody wants to try to capture the value added from processes of industrialization, notably green industrialization, there are trade tensions. For us specifically, I'll finish with this maybe by just some thoughts for the discussion. So I think that we are increasingly thinking about trade policy, the EU's trade policy, which again is a very small part of the way in which what governs our international economic relations. And let's be clear about what the common commercial policy covers and does not cover. It's a limited set of things. But I think we need to see it more and more as an enabling policy. In particular, as a policy which is, again, part of a suite of microeconomic policies that support the global competitiveness of the big parts of the European economy. For the tools, and in particular for the trade policy tools, and notably the trade protection tools, whether it is structural trade protection or trade contingency, I think we're coming to the view that we don't need to repurpose these tools. It's not about repurposing these tools. We've had internal discussions about this inside the Commission. These tools were, I think Teresa Ribera said that as well for the FSR, and it's exactly the same for trade defense instruments. They were not designed with economic security or resilience in mind within their framework, the level playing field instruments, fundamentally. But increasingly, we have to take into account the context in which they are being implemented. And the context is that there is a need to have policies that relate to economic security and resilience. So there are ways in which you can take these considerations into account without fundamentally changing the nature, the logic, or even the legal framework under which these tools operate. That's what the economic security communication of last week says with respect to trade defense instruments, if you have had a chance to see this. In a sense, I suspect, but I don't want to speak, of course, because I don't operate the instrument, it's lodged with DG Competition, but the same issue is at play with respect, for example, to an instrument such as the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, I would have thought, because again, the Foreign Subsidies Regulation has a proximity to trade defense instruments, notably countervailing duties. It covers a gap that trade defense instruments do not cover. So I think that's maybe how we're thinking about the continuous adaptation of trade policy and trade policy instruments, which was the focus of your question, inter alia. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis. So we heard it. The environment has radically changed. We are basically living in a flux where we go away from free trade to, and what we are seeing is that, as you termed it, disintegration of supply chains, I would say, right? Where we basically face new barriers. Emanuele, now we heard how DG Trade is reacting and how they are sharpening their tools. I mean, Denis said it already, that he's expecting that DG Comp might also react. So what's your view? How do we need to react in our competition toolbox?
Okay, so first of all, let me thank you and CRA for inviting me to join this panel. I have to say it's very refreshing to be in a panel with different faces, different backgrounds, speaking about super timely issues with very distinguished speakers. So it is indeed evident that the world has changed and that this scenario has been evolving, has been very well illustrated by my fellow panelists. And I think, as Paola was remarking, this is not something that has happened only over the last 6-7 months. both Trump administration, but also Biden administration have been taking policies in the direction of making trade more difficult by raising tariffs. So this is something on which we should reflect on from a broader perspective than just the last Liberation Day. I wanted to convey, and I will try to be brief in the interest of time, two key takeaways in this first question. First, that competition policy objectives should not change. And second, that despite this, it's still important to understand the linkages between the policies we're discussing, competition policy, industrial policy, and trade policy. So to begin with, as the EVP has been making very clear, we remain keen to enforcing the rule of law, a rule-based approach, with the goal of preserving markets' contestability, preventing the inefficient market power, and promoting the welfare of consumers. This is how DG Comp tries to promote to foster the competitiveness of European firms, and as it is important to foster the affordability of goods and services for consumers. Having said that, it is clear that nowadays competition policy cannot be seen and analyzed in a vacuum, and more closely operates alongside with industrial policy and trade policy. And as much as I think that competition policy should remain the cornerstone of public intervention, not just for DG Comp, it would be foolish to think that we should not reflect on how other policies interact with it. After all, trade policy shapes market access with consequences on strategic dependencies. Industrial policy, especially, I always like to put pro-competitive, as Benoît has been doing next to industrial policy. Pro-competitive industrial policy defines investment capacity in Europe. So obviously there are linkages between these three forms of public interventions, but it's very reassuring to hear, this is something that I firmly believe, but also the others in this panel, that they share a common ultimate objective, which is fostering the economic growth and prosperity, as Marcus very nicely put. And when it comes to industrial policy, especially when defined in a way that is pro-competitive and efficient.
Good, thanks. Marcus, do you have any quick reactions on that? What's the UK perspective?
On whether competition policy should be influenced by strategic autonomy.
On whether our toolbox should evolve, right? How should we...
Well, no, I think it's different. Those are different questions. Absolutely. Absolutely, resilience, security, strategic autonomy should influence competition analysis. I would argue that's always been the case, and it's not new. It may not have been enforced that way, but remember, it goes back to the fundamental objectives. If the idea of competition policy is to enable economic growth through promoting competitive alternatives, and a competitive alternative between sources of supply is only effective competition if that source of supply can be relied upon to sustain over a reasonable period of time and not be hostage to capture or or suddenly withdrawn by powers or nations who don't share the same values or interests in rule-based trade, for example. And so it's not new. The observation I'd have is that what defines essential infrastructure, essential goods and services, and which powers can be relied upon to provide reasonably lasting competitive alternative supply, that does evolve. And so it's absolutely the role of authorities, never mind governments, to keep a radar on what source of supply can be relied upon to provide competitive dynamic pressure and or incentive and innovation, and which can't. In the past, that was, Russia is not a relevant competitive set if a company is controlled by the Russian state. Nowadays, companies controlled by China are not considered a relevant competitive set in analysis of telecom market. And now what people are discovering, as I've said before, is that there are certain digital services, digital infrastructure, that maybe no longer have a relevant competitive set providing pressure because they are proving to be under the potentially under the influence of powers who do not share the same interests that the rest of the world does in trade. I would just finish by saying that there's a lot of shared interests to provide vibrant, competitive alternatives to monopolies, not just within the EU, but with the UK, with Japan, with Korea, with Brazil, with India. It just takes a little bit of political leadership to get that coalition to really lean into that opportunity.
So what I hear is that basically the dependent trade environment is not undermining our objective of fostering competition. Now, I should say that we are running a bit late in terms of time. We had prepared 2 instruments where we want to dive a bit deeper, FSR, which was already mentioned, and also what it means for, especially for our more traditional antitrust instruments. Now, we won't have time to deep dive into both topics. Can I have a quick hands up what we should do? Should we do FSR more, or should we cover traditional tools more in detail? Let's maybe first hands up for FSR. Who wants to go more into FSR? I see. And who wants to go more into traditional tools? Oh, that's a close call. That's a close call.
It's a conservative crowd.
What do we do now? What do we do now? Okay, let's take a Solomonic decision then and be short on both.
I thought it was pretty clear.
And so quickly on FSR, Emanuele. So we heard already that FSR was made already before the latest durations. Let's put it like that. But it's a very interesting instrument because it's the idea is that we need a level playing field within the EU. How do you see the role evolving of the FSR now that we are seeing all these trade challenges?
So again, here what I want to convey is that FSR is a tool that responds to an important need, which is to preserve the level playing field within the internal market, but at the same time, we should enforce it very carefully because we want to maintain the impression that the European Union is an open economy that welcomes FDI. So coming back to the FSR and why it's been introduced. The FSR is being introduced to respond to the legitimate need for a tool that allows the Commission to intervene in the presence of subsidies that distort the level playing field in internal market. More specifically, as Denis was already mentioned, FSR covers the case of services and investments like acquisitions, so also mergers, that were not captured by other trade tools or the WTO. So in essence, the FSR was adopted in the absence of multilateral solutions to address international subsidies in these 2 areas, services and investments. Now, while of course countries are free to subsidize their companies as part of their sovereignty, what DG COM tries to do is make sure that this doesn't come with distortions on competitive dynamics. Because thanks to unlimited guarantees or unrestricted access to finance, subsidized companies may acquire others that are unsubsidized, which have generated their market position on their IP thanks to or through a tough competitive process, and this is unfair. Even more so in the current geopolitical context, in which essentially the Commission doesn't want to be subject to a very dangerous form of arbitrage, which gives an undue advantage to companies that are subsidized by sovereign countries, foreign countries. Having said that, and as I said at the beginning, we should keep very clear that FSR should not be used as a trade defense tool, nor should be weaponized, and I agree with Denis on this, and should be enforced with extreme care and balance. Why? Because again, we really want to promote foreign direct investments in Europe. We want to preserve the impression that Europe is a welcoming economy. Europe is currently one of the largest recipients of FDI. Despite this, has been reducing recently, especially after 2022 energy crisis. And so FDI remain an indispensable source of dynamism and bring in competition innovation. Overall, however, I may say that the Commission has been very balanced and practical and realistic when it comes to FSR enforcement. There have been only 2 final adoption decisions over the last since it's been entering into force. I'm happy to talk about the tiers of distortion that FSR should tackle, but
let's keep it. Let's keep our spirit of keeping this short and brief. But Emanuele, right now you're processing the feedback to your market consultation for the draft FSR guidelines. Do you have any top 1 takeaway that you want to spread in this audience?
No. No, what I can say is that there has been a very, let's say, lively process of feedback provided by stakeholders and experts. This is not surprising because the tool is new, and as I said, it covers investments and precisely because it covers in sense that also mergers. What has been the main thread that we can take away out of this comments is the need for additional practical guidance in the way the Commission is trying to enforce the FSR, and also the provision of additional examples that may be useful for parties. So, and this is why, as a chief economist team, we've been collaborating with the case team. It's been very fruitful collaboration within DG Comp in terms of providing guidance on which economic principles can shape investigation, in particular on the 2 main pillars of the FSR, which are the tiers of distortion and the balancing of the subsidies.
Great. Paola, now, I mean, we heard it that, FSR is, somewhere sits in between competition and trade. You mentioned already countervailing trade measures. And I wonder, do you see any similarities here? Is there anything that we can learn from a, trade perspective on FSR?
Okay, quickly. So first of all, I said that there was an export shock due to China. There was also an FDI shock. And I think that has led to FSR and FDI screening. So China has not only exported a lot, but started investing massively. And this raised security concerns and competition concerns. That's why we have all these new FDI regulations. Now, FSR, from what I understand, is very similar in a spirit to countervailing duties, which is one of the trade defense instruments. And it is, meant to offset subsidies. In the case of countervailing duties, subsidize exports or imports, if you look from the point of view of the importing country. And in the case of FSR, is investments that will lead to mergers or procurement. And I think, a key example of countervailing duties, a topical one recently, is on EVs. We all know, you probably all know, the countervailing duties have been imposed by the EU in, was it December 2024? On imports of electric vehicles from China. This is a 35% duty on some companies. So it's tailored to particular companies, and it's on top of the underlying 10% duty. One of the key differences to me, when I was thinking of the 2 instruments, FSR and countervailing duty, is that FSR is quite blunt. It's 0-1. You block a merger or not, you don't allow a company to operate or to participate in procurement. It's not like a duty. In the case of countervailing duty, what you do is investigate whether there have been subsidies, how large they've been, you determine the margin, and then you offset the subsidized margin with the duty. Here, instead, in the case of investments, FDI, it's been more 0-1. And one interesting conversation we could have is whether this could be a more tailored policy, one that is continuous rather than a dummy. And I could talk more, but I see you're in a rush.
Yeah,
so.
let's move on. But that's
move on.
interesting. So this means basically that probably that's a useful takeaway for Emanuele. So we need to have more shades of gray, so to say. But let's discuss this further, in the break then. Moving on to the more traditional tools. Emanuele, so I mean, of course, top on our mind is merger, antitrust. I mean, merger in particular. I mean, we heard these calls for more consolidation in Europe, and there are different justifications for that. One of those justifications is that we need to facilitate international expansion, and that basically as trade becomes more complicated, maybe we need more superheroes in Europe that can do this expansion. What do you think about that, Emanuele?
Thank you. If we look backward and think about merger policy in the past, it seems to me that enforcement in Europe has led to global expansion already. So merger policy is not per se an impediment to this. Think about Siemens Alstom. Think about Alstom Bombardier, which allowed, which allowed Alstom. So it allowed Alstom to grow its presence in North America. So this is not per se something new and something that should change. What probably we have to reflect about is how the international context changes the way our competition tools operate. Taking, of course, stock of the changes that are happening in international trade. For example, the international geopolitical context can be very important to develop theories of harm, analysis in the theories of harm. Certain practices of structural changes like mergers are more harmful when we abandon a world characterized by multilateral relationships. So if we think about scaling up internationally or scaling up for fundamental critical inputs, I can think of reasons why this makes the supply chains less resilient, developing theories of harm going into this direction. There is recent research by Massimo, Volker, and Martin discussing precisely this, how the geopolitical risk can generate situations in which competitors or competitive constraints may disappear in the foreseeable future. So as authorities, we need to account for this in developing our assessment of mergers with horizontal or vertical consequences.
Great, and again, touching upon the guidelines, this time the merger guidelines, Emanuele. So we will cover that in detail in the next session, of course. But is there any trade-related points or observations that you have? So could we, for instance, is it a fair understanding that in the future we might see trade-related, efficiencies or efficiency defenses, merger clearances?
So I wouldn't say, again, I wouldn't talk about trade. If I think about what it means, I have a hard time finding any good argument to discuss for the guidelines. The guidelines the guidelines is a tool that is there for 20 years. We're now in the process of redrafting them. The EVP was very clear that our goal is to make them more modern in terms of developing an efficiency chapter that tackles the situations in which companies, by merging, have stronger incentives to invest. But of course, accounting also for the evolution of times, including resilience or other forms of innovation.
Great. I see that Benoît wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to your question, Beno, I don't think there is a trade defense. I don't think that makes any kind of sense economically or legally for all the reasons we've discussed. But there is one area where we need to put a lot more structure on the conversation, which is resilience. Resilience is everywhere in the political discussion. There is no a single definition of what it implies, and there is no clear understanding on how competition can help and to which extent it can help. And I very much hope that the guidelines can help, organize the discussion so that we can identify in a very precise way how a resilience defense can comply with competition law and can make sense economically. I think it can. I think it's not an empty space, but it's not going to work all the time. And so if we think for instance, of upstream dependencies, the way Denis explained them, like dependency on rare earth, key upstream inputs, there might be cases where, say, a merger, or even, by the way, an agreement. I mean, it could be either a merger or antitrust. I don't think it makes a difference at that stage, at that level of generality. There can be instances where the merger can help and can help to secure access to upstream components, inputs in a way that is pro-competitive. But there might be public policy instruments that work much better. And so that's really a discussion to be had. Are we going to do that through competition? Are we going to do that through FDI screening? Are we going to do that through regulation? And that's a discussion that, of course, extends beyond competition, which leads me to my last point, which is a kind of political point. In areas where you've got to choose between different policy instruments, that's not something that you can leave to a competition enforcer. I mean, we are bureaucrats with narrow mandates. And so I'm perfectly happy if, say, the French minister tells me, look, this merger may be bad from a competition standpoint, but I do need it because it will secure access to such or such rare earth. I think that's a good discussion to be had. But at the end, that should be a political decision, and the minister should be publicly accountable for it, not me.
So that's clear separation of powers. That's a fantastic segue, Benoît, into our next topic for discussion, because now we have, discussed with the time available, to what extent we want to or we need to evolve our competition toolkit, and I take away that resilience is one of the topics that we might, take with us into the next sessions, and then it's a matter of labeling whether that's then called, resilience defense or resilience efficiencies, or whether we should tackle it at all in our merger review, but that's probably for the next session then. Let us here now move on and think a little bit and discuss a little bit the interplay between trade and competition in the enforcement reality. And we heard already, and this is why Benoît's segue is really fantastic, that, of course we're living in a world where everything is set up to have certain discretion, certain flexibility. I mean, in the Commission we have college decisions, and as Denis said it, there is, of course, the risk that trade measures are weaponized, and that, of course, poses a risk or can pose a risk that we might need certain flexibility on the competition enforcement side, just because we have also trade objectives, and then we have these systems that may be more or less transparent. So, Denis, maybe to set the scene for our discussion, can you quickly talk us through, what you've seen with other countries attempting to, link changes in other policies, trade and competition? I mean, were there any demands for having a, more lenient competition enforcement, DMA, for instance?
Well, first, just to put this a bit into perspective, I mean, when it comes to trade negotiations, trade agreements, there are non-economic linkages in that world. I mean, let's be a bit realistic about this. If anything, we are quite good at doing this out of Europe. I mean, if you look at the sustainability provisions in our trade treaties, they go beyond pure economic, let's say, a level playing field, non-regression type provisions. I mean, they seek to achieve certain things through a positive incentive, in this case in mutually agreed trade treaty, and we even do this through unilateral preferences, We've amended the so-called GSP, the General System of Preferences, and you may have seen that this brings in clear non-economic objectives as part of that incentive. There's a big difference between that and actually coercing and coercion. Hard coercion, interference in domestic affairs by imposing trade restrictive measures, not in order to create a new stable situation, but also in order to transactionally impose them, take them away, in order to obtain something which is at the core of sovereignty. And I think that is the real problem. There's a temptation globally for that to happen. And I tend to agree with what Benoît said on this. It's very simple. We may have to address this and confront this, and this is why we have given ourselves at the EU level some tools, instruments, in order to be able to take decisions. Of course, they go far beyond a normal, let's say, economic logic trade-off decisions. They're core foreign policy decisions with respect to partners. But we have an instrument called the anti-coercion instrument, this regulation. It may at some point be used. I don't know. It depends entirely on the determination that will be made at the time between the Commission and Member States. We have to decide on a qualified majority basis on this. What we are not keen to do ourselves is to weaponize interdependencies. And this is why both trade tools and competition tools, I tend to agree as well with something you said. There's a big difference when you have systems where you can have one person taking a decision, out of the blue saying, I'm going to impose X% tariff, and having rules-based instruments, which of course have to reflect reality, as I said earlier, which of course will not operate in a vacuum, but which tends to be based on proper rules for decision-making. And also, interestingly, in many cases, whether it's, I suppose, competition instruments or trade defense, which are investigations-based. And being investigations-based is interesting and important because it enables you to get a sense of what is going to be the downstream impact of what you do in terms of economic efficiency and competitiveness at the end of the day. So all these things, I think, we want to preserve, as well as, of course, our own regulatory autonomy. So I think that's how we are certainly on the trade side, this is how we are approaching this question of weaponization.
Great. Help us please to understand, in what way we want to, or we do, or we are leveraging, the discretion that we have in organizations like the Commission. So one instance that is probably, in the mind of many here, is the Google AdTech case, where we saw that there was an announcement in 1 week in September on a Monday, where Commissioner Šefčovič then announced that it would not be, a very good moment to issue now a prohibition decision against Google, given that there were ongoing trade discussions. Like now you mentioned basically efficiency considerations, investigations. This type of news to me didn't strike me as something that's very investigation-driven. Is that a fair observation?
You don't seriously expect me to comment on this? Seriously?
Comment, mate.
Okay.
You should have asked Teresa Rivera. She's a member of the college, not me.
She's gone. So, okay, let's yet another topic for the coffee break. Let us move on to Markus then. We heard it. Trade and international competitiveness became broader government priorities. In the EU, but also in the UK, I reckon. How does that impact antitrust enforcement, if I may naively ask?
So he wouldn't answer the question, so you thought you'd ask me.
You can. Please help us.
Three observations, I guess. The first is just to clarify an assumption behind your question, that growth and trade and international competitiveness has suddenly become a priority for the UK government. Let me just make clear that international competitiveness and growth has always been a priority for UK governments. That's not changed. Now, they may have been less and more effective over time at achieving that, but that's always been the objective of every government. That's not changed. What has changed is, I think, one fundamental understanding, which has been lost or not absorbed or disavowed, which is, I think, this understanding that used to exist that really high
concentration of economic power in the hands of a very few monopolies or duopolies, especially when it's in the areas of essential goods and services, essential infrastructure, that creates a complete dependency that is highly damaging in the long term and the medium term and the short term, both on innovation and growth, but also on the ability to set your own laws and set your own policies and have democratic autonomy. And see, that understanding has been lost or not yet learned or absorbed or maybe disavowed by some parts of the government, or at least those who set the economic policy part of it. The second observation is, has trade become a bargaining chip, together with enforcement in these discussions? I mean, or will it become? I mean, it already has become. It's very clear, and it's not a secret. The US, in its discussions with the EU and with the UK, there is one discussion with multiple levers. Now, I won't talk about the EU, I'm less close to that, but the discussion and the negotiation of a US and the UK have one conversation that covers, well, will we support security more or less, in terms of defense? Will we invest more? Will we have our digital technology platform companies invest more, or are you going to stop enforcing competition law and consumer protection law and give them some exemptions? Will copyright protection be exempt or not for some of our leading in global platforms compared to the rest of the economy? Should you have online safety protections at all, or even for everybody versus just a subset? And should you set tax policy that impacts digital firms, even though the tax policy is meant to make things equal between all firms? So that's not a should or will it. I mean, it's happening, and it's a reality. And so if you're sort of a medium-sized nation, right, a medium-sized economic nation, which is most of the world outside the US and China, you have a choice, right? You either say, I'd like to combine forces with nations who have similar shared interests in rules-based systems, in free trade, in having vibrant alternatives to monopolies in certain essential services, because I think that's good for everybody, it's good for autonomy, etc., national security. Or, I try and go it alone, and whether I want to or not, I end up initiating a race to the bottom. Right? And so you see what's happened to date, which is, so in the UK at least, we have achieved relatively modest additional tariffs on exports for having a deficit with the US in goods rather than a surplus. We've achieved a 3 to 4% share of the global investment of 5 big technology firms in line with our share of global GDP. We've kept the online safety regulation and the digital safety tax, and there's a decision that's been made not to apply effectively the copyright protection for the creative industry from AI scrapers, who then use it as free raw material to sell back to businesses and consumers in the UK. And similarly, you've all commented to me privately as well as publicly. It's fairly clear. There's been a softening or even a lack of enforcement of the digital markets competition regime since the sort of end of January, with the abandonment of the planned or much anticipated strategic market investigation into Amazon and Microsoft, very publicly abandoned, in fact, and the going slow and low, I've called it in the past, on the enforcement of the 2 strategic market status investigation that had been opened before the government came to this strategic trade-off, by not imposing remedies on Google and Apple, and or indicating a fairly ineffective set of remedies in the near term. So it has an impact. It's the result of choices that governments make. So that brings me to my third point, which is absolutely, and this links to what Benoît was saying, if you're a government of any nation and you have a large majority, it's absolutely in your right and, in fact, responsibility to say, The way I look at the world is this, and so I need to increase my strategic dependency on one partner versus multiple partners. I need to increase my dependency on a few global monopoly providers, because that brings me other benefits which I believe in and that I hold myself accountable. And therefore, I want to change the law and change the statutory powers of authorities, and that's what we're going to do. And that's a perfectly good way of doing it. The not so good way of doing it, of course, is to do it in backroom conversations and on the sly, and then pretend that you're not doing it. Because if you talk, again, bringing it back to the business and consumer perspective, the one thing that all businesses will tell you again and again is, at the end of the day, if I happen to have access to a person in power in government, and I happen to have a good chip that I can trade, I might benefit. But in the long run, that's just unpredictable. An unpredictable economy. I have no idea whether an investment or a merger or anything will be approved or not, depending on whether or not I have the access or the whim of an individual who happens to be in power. And so it's not surprising that you get less investment over time, you get less choices being made by businesses, certainly those who have a chance of innovating and competing. And you have a much higher cost of debt, because creditors are also business people, and they think, well, I can't rely on this. So there are some sober lessons being learned as we speak, I would argue, which can still be learned and applied by other nations, if not today in the UK.
That's interesting. So we need to watch out for situations where these objectives might collide between trade and competition. Before I move on to Paola, you're right now seeing here some codes. And so we listened actually to the feedback last year. And there was a feedback that we need to have a more interactive process in our conference, where we can also ask questions, where the audience can ask questions. And our way of feeding in your questions is through Slido. So if there's anybody here who has a question, please feed it in. I will see it then on the tablet and then pass it on to the panelists. We have we can maybe accommodate 1 or 2 questions, but until we have questions popping up here on Slido, I will move on and will ask Paola. Now, Paola, we saw that, Markus was identifying instances where we need to watch out, and he gave us also the fuller perspective of what can happen on the positive and negative side if we are basically flexible. What's your take on this? Where should we be particularly careful?
It's interesting that you could talk freely because you've left government, you've left the authority, so you can speak freely about the pressure and the weaponizing. No, so I think what was interesting, what you said is, you picked up on the role of lobbying and how large firms can shape decision maybe on mergers, maybe in the UK, not in the EU yet. But, I think it's interesting is that if I think about large corporations, probably they don't like uncertainty, so they now see that if you want to acquire a company in Europe, you have to comply with merger regulation, FDI screening, FSR, so there's a web of complex rules, and that creates uncertainty. There's also different, sometimes it's merger states apply, sometimes it's the EU, so it's complex and uncertain, and that should deter investment. On the other hand, sometimes this creates flexibility, and then large companies can better navigate, can have the eye or the ears of the politicians. And I think, so again, in the EU, it's a bit of a pity that we don't have very good data on lobbying. There is some data, there's we know who meets with whom at the Commission, but in the US, where I've done extensive work, you have very detailed quarterly data on what every company lobbies, how much it spends lobbying on each particular issue. So I've done work with various co-authors, and what you see is that on any issue, really, it's large companies that dominate the lobbying. It's large multinational corporations that, for example, dominate lobbying on free trade agreements, and that's understandable. They benefit from reduction of tariffs to FTAs. But you also see that there's no participation whatsoever of small companies. They just have no voice in the process because it's very costly to participate in the lobbying game. And so you do see that large companies shape both whether an agreement enters into force and even the content of trade agreement. Denis was mentioning that these trade agreements include labor and environmental standards, include IPR, they're very deep. And companies can shape this policy. So my take, we had this discussion a couple of days ago, is it would be interesting to understand better what's, I know many, so I guess people are here lawyers or economists, but some people may be working in business. And business is trying to understand the rules, navigate the rules, but they can also influence the rules. And I think we need to understand better. I'm not saying this is necessarily bad. They need to have a voice. But I think, it's definitely the case that not all companies have the same weight in the process.
Perfect, excellent. So we will keep our eyes open for an upcoming publication from you then on that topic, Paola.
We need more data.
Yeah, once you have the data. And I should say that there are no questions yet here from the floor. So I wanted to give an opportunity to all of the panelists, if there's any comment you have on what our insights that we've discussed mean for the future. Is it like one sentence statements? Is there anybody who wants to make a statement? Otherwise, I would have a few. Yeah, perfect, Benoît.
No, I just want. Can you hear me? No, you can't hear me.
Now we can
because Paola wanted to keep the floor.
No.
It's competition.
But I was going to praise you, Paola, and to actually react to your last comment on lobbying and the disproportionate influence of big companies on the lawmaking process and on trade negotiations. I think that's if we ever needed it, that's another reason why any discussion on the future of merger reviews and the future of antitrust enforcement should not water down competition enforcement. And that reason is that companies with a lot of market power have a disproportionate advantage in engaging with in the political discussion. They have an opportunity to some extent to set their own rules through the lobbying process. And they also have the resources to master and implement large, complex regulations, for which Europe is, of course, number one in the world. So we have all these, new regulations which have been voted over the last 5 years or so. They are very complex. They interact in ways which the Parliament and the Commission doesn't always understand themselves. These big companies have all the means to take advantage of this very complex regulation in Europe for their own purposes and to increase their profits. So that's another reason why we should adapt competition law. We should react to what's going on in the world. There is no room to be complacent and to claim that business can stay as usual, but this cannot come at the expense of a watering down of competition enforcement.
Understood. Is there anybody else on the panel who wants to have a final comment? No? Otherwise, we do have one question from the floor now, and this is on FSR, and the question is FSR already a failed instrument? So it seems that we have, and the question is, are we, instead of targeting Chinese companies, using FSR as a weapon to distort companies from allied economies, whatever this means? Is there, so the question is there hasn't been much enforcement yet, but we are seeing already that instead of targeting Chinese companies, which was the intention originally, it has become a weapon to distort companies from allied economics. So whatever this means. Is there, Emanuele, do you have any idea?
I don't understand exactly where the question is coming from, in the sense that the FSR is being used, as I said, with particular care, precisely because we don't want to have a weaponized trade tool. On top of that, the claim that FSR is for targeting Chinese companies against what we've been saying in this panel throughout, which is that we're trying to enforce a rule-based approach, an approach that where rules apply for everybody. And if a distortionary subsidy comes from a different country, the rule applies as well. So we had two final adoptions. We have investigations going. I can tell you that FSR takes a lot of my time, so I wouldn't say it's dead. It's actually up and running.
So that's a very that's a very important message. FSR, your optimism in relation to FSR. Let us use this optimistic note to close today's discussion. Let me thank hugely the panelists, and please join me in applauding the discussion.